In my society, basically every society I've ever been in the world, what I've seen is there's a lot of stigma in general attached to saying, I don't really have much contact with my parents. I have taken distance from my parents. I don't talk to my parents. I have a lot of boundaries set up with my parents where I really don't like my parents. What I've seen is most people just have a quick reflex to say, that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing, you should reconnect with them, you should forgive them. Even looking at me like there's something wrong with me or something like inherently unhealthy about what I am doing. And what I saw for a long time early on, especially when I first started really breaking away from my parents, is when I felt this stigma from people in society, even from people who, to varying degree, were friends of mine. What I did to combat this stigma was to try to defend my point of view more. I'd say, no, it's not bad what I'm doing. Let me explain why I am taking distance from my mother. Let me explain why I am taking distance from my father. Let me explain how my dad actually literally treated me. Let me explain why I am not wanting to have a relationship with him. Let me explain how perverse and sick and dishonest my mother was repeatedly and still is. And what I found by and large is why I stopped doing that, defending myself so much so publicly out in the world with strangers or people that I was getting to know, was that it mostly didn't work. What I found is their reflex to defend my parents, to consider me unhealthy for breaking away from them, was so deeply embedded in them that it was impervious to argument. Then I think of extreme cases, because sometimes I would even try to get intellectual about it and use intellectual arguments. Like I would say, well, what if I told you that my father had repeatedly raped me as a child? Would you still be defending him? Because what I saw a lot of times is when I would say how horribly my dad treated me, people would say, you have to forgive him. You always must forgive your parents. They brought you into this world. They loved you most of all. If it wasn't for them, you wouldn't exist. So I would say, well, would you be saying that if I told you my father actually physically raped me? And then I would see people get uncomfortable. Often they just kind of pulled out of the argument, because what I saw is that really strong contradictory arguments made them uncomfortable. Basically, they didn't want to challenge the basic belief that they had, but it was even more than a belief. It was like an emotional gut reflex that I saw. And then I started realizing another thing about this stigma that most people had put on people who broke away from their parents, was that unconsciously, now I'm going to get into a little bit more psychology, analysis of a lot of these people I saw, is that unconsciously a lot of them wanted to break away from their parents too. When I actually listened to their stories over time, because that's another thing I started doing. Okay, let's not make it about me. But over time I was like, well, tell me, I'm curious about your childhoods. And a lot of times they would talk about what they went through. And what I started realizing is a lot of them had actually worse childhoods than I had had. Their parents were worse to them than my parents had been to me. And a lot of these people, most of them, all of them perhaps, had terribly painful, buried feelings about what had happened to them. And how they had dealt with those painful buried feelings is by just blocking them out, not being aware of what their feelings were, burying them deep down below the surface so they could still believe the fantasy that they had a good childhood, that their parents really loved them, that their parents were great and really there for them. They really were living in a fantasy. And what I was doing by overtly breaking away from my parents and, heaven forbid, overtly talking about it, just talking about the reality of what my life was. And I'm not talking that I was getting out there and doing what I'm doing now, which is sort of preaching my point of view. Sometimes it was only like, what I was only saying was in response to, they asked me, oh, do you talk to your parents? Are your parents alive? And sometimes I was just sort of minimally, bluntly honest. Well, yes, my parents are alive. No, I don't talk to them. Why? Why don't you talk to them? Well, I found that they were very harmful to me. They're still abusive and disrespectful to me. They don't honor who I am. They don't like me for who I am. They wanted me to be something that I'm not, so it's just better for me to be away from them. Or simply, they're just very toxic to me. They don't acknowledge how toxic, and people will just, no, 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 you can't do that. You must go back to them. You must forgive, blah, blah, blah. And then realizing that these people, well, a lot of them had worse parents than mine, and they were actually following their own advice to me by burying all their feelings, being stunted people in many ways, not really developing into healthier, independent, emotionally independent adults who really had a deep sense of self. As long as they were blocking all those feelings, blocking their childhood history, blocking their childhood memories, blocking their healing process, blocking their grieving process, they could never really manifest into independent people who had a real, true, independent self. And a lot of these people, and I think this is a big part of why they so stigmatized me for breaking away from my parents, was a lot of these people became parents themselves and played out these very screwed up dynamics with their own children. And when they heard me say things like, yeah, I took distance from my parents were rotten to me in lots of ways, they identified with my parents because in many ways they were very similar to my parents, even in ways that they maybe weren't so conscious of, but somehow sort of reflexively, intuitively, I might as well have been talking about them as parents. And so they sided with my parents because they didn't identify with their own children. They saw me as like, oh my God, if this guy's taking distance from his parents, what if my children did this? And what I saw is some of the most stigmatizing people in my personal life, actually the most stigmatizing people in my personal life, stigmatizing against me from taking distance and breaking from my parents, were my actual parents. Also my grandparents, absolutely stigmatizing against me. It's like the message I got from my parents immediately when I started breaking from them, even when I started breaking from them, hinting that I wanted boundaries, better, healthy boundaries from them, but really as time went on, more and more and more healthy boundaries to the point that I needed a lot of distance. My parents hated me for that. They despised me. It terrified them. It was like they were losing their power. They were losing their control over me. It's like the slave that I was starting to become free. And that rebellion terrified them, but it really wasn't a rebellion. What it was an emancipation movement inside of myself. And part of why it terrified them was that I was calling them out, either directly or just sort of inadvertently through saying, I don't want to be so close to you. It called them out on their bad behavior. It embarrassed them. It caused them fear. It caused them shame. But also, it shined a light on, heaven forbid, why they were doing those things to me, why they had been so violating of me in so many different ways. And what it brought them back to, and they didn't want to go there, was what had happened to them in their childhoods, what their parents had done to them. And they were terrified of looking at that because they weren't ready to break from their own parents. They were on their own parents' side more than they were on the side of their wounded child. And so they stigmatized their own child inside of them for that deeply latent, buried sense of wanting to be free. And so by extension, they stigmatized me, and they stigmatized everybody who wanted to do what I was doing and talking about. And I've seen that as so common in the world and so painful. And what is the cure for this stigma in my life? Well, one thing I've realized is I can't change people. I can't convince people that I am right for wanting to do what I have done and what I'm continuing to do more and more. I can't convince people who stigmatize me, so I don't even try to worry about that. I mean, yes, it's painful to be stigmatized. I don't want to say it's not painful because it is inherently painful. Who wants to be rejected? Who wants to be stigmatized? It's not fun. But what I do is I'm more careful about who I tell things about my personal life. I want people to earn my truth more. I want people to earn my confidence more. The people who I let closer to me often are people who deserve it more, people who are more honoring of me, people who are healthier. My closer world to me is people who are more mature, who have better empathy, not just for me and what I'm doing, but for their own self inside of themselves. People who have developed their own lives more, have better boundaries with their own parents, have better memories of what happened to them, have resolved more of their traumas, identify and side more with the child in the power dynamic between parents and children. Because so often in our world, what's considered normal is to intuitively, reflexively side with the parent in this power dynamic. It's a strange thing. I mean, a lot of people like the underdog in all sorts of different ways, except when it comes to the child in their relationship with the parent. And then they side with the parents, because often they still side with their own parents. So for me, I have flipped that script in my life. I much more intuitively and reflexively now side with the child in the relationship. I side with the emotional underdog in the power dynamic. And I side with the child that I was and the still wounded childlike sides of me. And for that reason, I actually don't see it as an stigmatized thing to break away from the parents. I see it as an honorable thing. I see it as a health-oriented thing. I see it as a step toward greater maturity, healing, honoring of the true self.